Hello, mates, it's Rife Nation. We've got Dave Feldman on the show, and we're going to be talking about the latest developments in cholesterol, in ApoB, ApoA, anything related to cardiovascular health. And it's been a privilege just to watch Dave Feldman and Nick Norovitz just speak about this area because I think there's some cutting edge science. And so I think one of the most controversial statements is we're going to be advising, and it's not medical advice, but it's biohacking health for you to eat as many Oreos as possible because it just will decrease your LDL cholesterol. So an Oreo cookie for those that are listening, and hopefully I've got your attention, but I am joking, but a warm welcome to Dave Feldman to the Mate to Thrive show.
Thank you for having me on, Steve.
Brilliant.
Appreciate
So we've
it.
got hopefully a bit of attention now for people listening in their cars or running on the road or wherever they are. But maybe just throw out your greatest hypothesis or your greatest, controversial statement that one says, "Hang on, oh my word, here are two guys in my community at Mate to Thrive speaking about something that I was pretty certain about from my own cardiologist or traditional Western medicine doc." Tell us what is happening with your hypothesis or with a controversial statement that people might not know.
Gosh, of what people might not know. Well, interestingly, at this point in time, we've released the study, and I mean, technically, we've actually published many points in time across the study, but there's the most recent paper. In the most recent paper, we publish both the semi-quantitative and the quantitative data, and we can kind of get a little bit more into that in a bit. But the most relevant finding is that it's really right there in the title. There's two of them. One is plaque begets plaque, or perhaps a better way of saying it is plaque predicts plaque. And secondly, that ApoB does not. In other words, there's an association between baseline plaque and progression of plaque. There's not an association that we were able to find between LDL or ApoB and that progression of plaque.
So maybe just unpack that for someone who's listening to say, okay, if I've got a bit of plaque and I find that plaque, that's going to result in more plaque. But if I go and I do an ApoB test, which most doctors don't even do here, Western medical doctors, you have got to go to someone who's in functional medicine or cardiologist that's on the ball here in South Africa and Africa, doing an ApoB test, that doesn't necessarily, or LDL cholesterol, the actual cholesterol, low density lipoprotein, that doesn't necessarily correlate to cardiovascular disease or plaque.
That's what our findings show, at least with regard to we saw no association between ApoB and the progression of plaque. Now, a couple caveats. Caveat number one is we're not making a claim as to whether or not taking actions to do something about the ApoB would be meaningful towards the outcome of plaque. I will say that there are existing studies long before ours that suggest if, for example, you have a CAC, a coronary artery calcification score of 0, so there's no calcification, your level of LDL did not. Likewise, even in people who have monogenetic FH, a genetic disease that results in high LDL and is independently associated with atherosclerosis, even for people who have that, but have like a CAC score of 0, that too didn't show an association between future negative outcomes of cardiovascular disease and their LDL levels, for example, right? So point being is that there's still this kind of large swath of mystery that we're still trying to work out as to those folks who do seem to be developing cardiovascular disease, how much of it really is, originating specifically from lipid levels versus how much of it are things we're still determining. Many things we do know, though, about, like, for example, things that are, of course, have a much higher association, such as insulin resistance, such as smoking, things along those lines. But we wanted to get a population. I mean, certainly this is what's been exciting me this whole time, like the ones we're focusing on, lean mass hyperresponders, to find out how much there would be that association between LDL and ApoB and plaque. Now, the other thing is there's sort of a pushback that our cohort, its cut points are 100. I want to say our eligibility is 190 milligrams per deciliter or higher. I want to convert it to millimoles for you, but I can't think of it right offhand.
Yeah,
I
it's
think it's
18. I'm going to just, because also that's the, now I'm going to get my phone now just to divide it by 18. You probably got the better brain than I do. So 190,
I think it's 38.
190
Uh,
divided by,
38 something.
yeah,
Anyway,
yeah, so 38. You would say it's 38, 190. divided by 38.
Yeah, I think it's around
Yeah, yeah,
five-ish.
yeah, 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 yeah. You're right.
Yeah.
What did I think?
So
8. Okay.
it's
Yeah.
around like say 5 millimoles,
Yeah,
something into
5
that.
millimoles. Correct.
Many people who are critics of our research and are very concerned about lean mass hyperresponders would say, well, because our cohort starts at 190 or 5 millimoles and goes up from there, then the association between ApoB and plaque progression is not that relevant because they hypothesize there's a saturation effect, that it's kind of like smokers. If you had somebody who smoked 2 packs a day versus somebody who smoked 3 packs a day, um, that the possibility that the 2 pack a day smokers might have about the same amount of cardiovascular disease as the 3 pack a day smokers would not be that surprising from that perspective. Here's the thing, though. There really, in the case of smoking, there really is a dose response,
Mm.
and it would be, especially for the spread we have, because it's not like we're looking at people that are 190 to 220. It goes from 190 to like 592, right? So we have this massive spread, bigger than any other, I think bigger than any other study that's existed before, such that being able to detect the dose response for the lipid hypothesis pushing forward that it's log linear should have emerged in the data. It should have been something that we would have seen, particularly for the increase observed for this middle-aged population.
Mm.
And so that's sort of my attempt to kind of steelman, um, I guess you could say the detractor side to this research.
Okay. So the question, what you're trying to sort of show and possibly prove is that, and I know it's been one or two studies, is that LDL cholesterol, even that being considered bad cholesterol, is not bad. It's part of the body. And ApoB, the carriers of the apolipoprotein, the carriers of cholesterol, do not necessarily correlate with cardiovascular or atherosclerosis or plaque formation. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, but to be fair to detractors, they would say it's also very relevant to look at percent change in non-calcified plaque volume, which was our pre-registered endpoint.
Okay.
The catch, as Dr. Budoff would point out, and as would Adrian Sotomoda, is because the plaque levels were so low at baseline, it's harder to follow the relative change. This is that age-old issue, right? The if the absolute numbers are so low to start with,
Yeah.
then the relative change gets less and less reliable because of the lower and lower measurement component. But that said, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't still talk about it. So
But does that
it's
mean you would just
important.
have to run the study a lot longer to see?
That's one of the things we're interested in, is not only getting an extension, but also we'd like a little more redundancy too. We're going to get other analyses. There's also a pre-registered methodology that we've not completed yet, and we're in the process of completing now, which is neither the semi-quantitative or clearly, which gave us the quantitative, but something called Q-angio. And Q-angio CT is another methodology. It's a bit more labor intensive for cardiology readers, but they'll be able to hopefully get us some additional data that can kind of confirm against the other two. One of the challenges we're having is that compared to other studies, our quantitative and our semi-quantitative don't agree with each other quite as much. And that's why we kind of want to get, further analyses in within it, I guess you could say.
You're saying that clearly, and I mean, I don't know about the clearly here. We've got a coronary artery score that we do here, calcium score, but the clearly is at the soft plaque and being able to quantify the soft plaque. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so for listeners who don't already know what you and I know, clearly spelled Cleery, clearly, is an AI guided algorithmic software. It's a platform that's a service. You send your CT angiograms to them, they process it, and then their AI algorithm comes up with these scorings. And as you mentioned, this includes both calcification and non-calcification. Our major endpoint was non-calcified plaque volume. And at the time that we were designing the experiment, it was in 2019, 2020. That was kind of what was in favor at the time. But we have a lot of metrics on what's called percent atheroma volume, or PAV. That's because it's sort of where cardiology and lipidology have gone since. But we include both. We have a lot of metrics on both sides.
Okay, so in terms of your next study is going to try and show what to progress this hypothesis or this understanding or this lack of correlation, because I think it must be quite hard to speak to lipidologists and sort of this main medical theme. It's gone from overall cholesterol being bad for you, then it was, oh, bad cholesterol, then it was the ratios of triglycerides to HDL, then, so there's so many, it's gone along a journey. So it must be quite difficult to change this thinking, especially within that sort of scientific field.
Yeah, I mean, this is just kind of the challenge overall is I feel as though since our study was released, there are, I want to say maybe 5 or 6 different components. I even had it in a list of all these different components. And there's only one that's being focused on, right? Like in its entirety, at the exclusion of all the others. So things like I mentioned, this sort of saturation hypothesis, it's kind of almost as if there's just a sense that there's no reason to look towards that correlation between ApoB and plaque formation if everybody on in the study has plaque of some level, which is it's kind of something that I was surprised was where, things moved to, I guess you could say. But to your point, it is another reason for us to just continue to do further follow-up
Mm.
because now it'll be interesting to see how much, say, a third set of scans with some number of participants, hopefully as many as we can get, would tell us about that progression and would also tell us more about that association between ApoB and LDL.
So it's a third set of scans and data that you need to take your hypothesis or your thinking further.
It's always great. I mean, it's still an ask. The participants didn't anticipate that there'd be a third round of scans, so we're in the process of getting the funding first, and then we go to the ask to
Mm.
not just the community as a whole, but in particular to these participants. But a lot of them have already said, on social media, actively that they're interested and would be excited for a possible third scan to help advance the science.
All right, maybe just unpack what happened, I think, with Nick and taking Oreos and his LDL came down and what a lean mass responder is, because I think people might have heard that and say, oh my goodness, Mate Thrice recommending Oreos for LDL cholesterol. But give us a little bit of a history and a background to that.
Sure. So basically, what he was doing was he was leveraging the components of the lipid energy model, which is central to our research. Lipid energy model posits that if you are on a low carb diet, and in particular, if you're metabolically healthy and especially lean, then what often happens is what happened to me. It was what got me launched into it. It's what happened to Nick. It's why he's into this. Is you see your cholesterol not only go through the roof, your so-called bad cholesterol, your LDL cholesterol. But you tend to also see this coupled with higher HDL cholesterol, the so-called good cholesterol, and low triglycerides. So this triad is what makes up what I referred to in 2017 and is now a common term for us in the literature, lean mass hyperresponders. Hyperresponder was already there before as in a hyper response of going keto and seeing your cholesterol go up. The lean mass I put on the front of it because it's just observationally typically the case
Mm.
that folks with this triad, these three together, tend to be leaner, tend to be metabolically healthier, and therefore they tend to see their cholesterol go higher. So we have a mechanistic hypothesis that's for this called the lipid energy model that we seek to explain this by. And what it comes down to is trafficking. It has to do with if you're moving more fat around in your body, then that requires a lot more of the carrier. And the major carrier of fat are called lipoproteins, appropriately because they're a combination of lipids and proteins. And they're kind of like a giant tanker, if you will, a submarine that's got a lot of cargo. And it's for all the lipids your body needs. It's not just, fuel, but it's also fat soluble vitamins and so forth. So the hypothesis is that those of us who are leaner, more metabolically healthy, we have more of our fat cells activated to both release and take back up fat so that they can continually just make it part of the buffet, if you will, that's in our bloodstream. But in so doing, they also get picked up a bit more by the liver, and the liver then synthesizes the triglycerides again, puts them back onto what's known as VLDLs, very low density lipoproteins, which are, full of these triglycerides of this fuel, which we're powered by. And then they very rapidly drop off that fuel and then turn into the very famous successor, LDL, low density lipoproteins. And so seeing more cholesterol, low density lipoprotein cholesterol, is kind of like seeing more of the emptied boats, the emptied submarines. It's just a reflection of how much cargo is being turned over on a regular basis back into the periphery. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. I know it gets a bit complicated, it's a bit
Mm,
geeky, but that's the basis. And we believe HDL and triglycerides help, they kind of give the signals to that happening. Your triglycerides, even if we believe you're powered more by it, they're low in the bloodstream for the same reason glucose would be low for an athlete who's even having a high carb diet. It's because they're utilizing it at
yeah.
a faster rate. They're turning it over at a faster rate, right? HDL being higher is typically due to the turnover. Your HDL actually gets higher due to a higher amount of the turnover of those triglycerides into your cells. And so that triad, we believe, is a signal to what is typically somebody who's metabolically healthy and on a very low carb diet.
Okay, so low carb diet, also lean, so not having a high fat percentage. So we do a lot of DEXA scans here with our clients and our patients. So you're talking about our triglycerides that are also low. So triglycerides, high LDL, high HDL, that triad, lean and metabolically healthy with a good insulin, fasting insulin.
That's right. In fact, the insulin being lower is very relevant to this whole equation. Because if your insulin is lower, especially your basal insulin, that's usually a signal to your body to activate more of your fat mass to release more and more. That's, this gets back to type 1 diabetics. If you have insulin insufficiency, what happens? Well, you lose all your fat. You eventually, you're losing muscle
Mm,
mass, everything else. It's, insulin's kind of what keeps it in place to some
mm.
degree. But as you become fat adapted, your body gets more adept at taking the fat out and putting it back at a faster rate.
Okay. So what does this actually mean for someone listening out there if they are lean and they're metabolically healthy, which we try and get people metabolically flexible to be able to use both fat, the diesel engine, what we call, and petrol, which is carbohydrates. They've got a good fasting insulin, a really good healthy HbA1c, don't have a lot of visceral fat. They've done a DEXA scan, but the HDL and the LDL is on the high side. Triglycerides are really low. So what does this mean for them?
Well, of course, I usually, I'm sure you've heard me say this a million times over, I'm not a clinician. I'm a researcher. My job is to get the data and to report it, right? I will say that I've gotten permission from a number of uh, doctors who are comfortable enough with me saying what their emerging position is. There's this kind of emerging position that if somebody goes on a low carb diet, they see their cholesterol shoot through the roof, they're a lean mass hyperresponder, then typically the next thing they like to do, these doctors, is go to imaging. Go ahead and get a CAC if the CAC is low to zero, or if they get a CT angiogram and the plaque levels are low to zero, right? Especially for their age category, then there's really so far not a lot of data that supports taking action with regard to your lipid levels. But if either of those two conditions aren't met, if either you're not metabolically healthy, or if there is existing concerning levels of plaque, then that's usually where they would choose to take steps, towards either lowering LDL or to treat it in some other fashion.
Okay. But from your perspective, is a CT angiogram far better than a CAC score, than a coronary artery calcium score, having been in the space now?
It's definitely, I think, the gold standard if you're wanting to go to that level. I've had myself two. I've had two CT angiograms, and technically you could say I've had three CACs, but I say technically because two of the CACs are just what's wrapped into a CT angiogram. That's the first pass that they do.
Okay.
So it might be worth taking a moment to explain why there's a choice in the first place. The coronary artery calcification scan is more widely available and it's usually cheaper. It's usually over here. It's anywhere between, I want to say, 50 to $300, depending on where you're at, so forth. It's not invasive. You lay down on the bed and then they scan you, but there's no contrast dye, which we'll get into in a moment. And the radiation dosage is really low. It's comparable to 1.5 times that of a mammogram. So for women who are getting a mammogram every year, that gives you kind of a sense, right? So that's a CAC, but the CAC only sees calcification. Now I'll put a pin in that because I'll come back to the value of that in a moment. Let's go to a CT angiogram. In the case of a CT angiogram, you lay down in the bed in the same way. You're still going through a CT machine, but you're going through it twice. The first time is when you're getting basically the same thing I just mentioned, CAC. They need to do that so they know how much calcification you have, because that'll determine the radiation dosage that's needed for the second part. So if in my case I had no calcification, then the second pass is much lower dosage of radiation, relatively speaking. And whereas I mentioned the first one is, I want to say it was like I want to say 0.6 is typical for a CAC. In my case, with both my CT angiograms, it's 2. And sorry, the units I'm using are millisieverts. Millisieverts is a radiation measure. And for a frame of reference, just walking around living on this earth, each year a person gets around 3.5 millisieverts. So that hopefully gives kind of a sense of, what the radiation, but it used to be a CT angiogram would be 20 times that. It was a lot of radiation. So it's come way down from what it is. Now, beyond the radiation dosage, the other consideration for a CT angiogram is what's called the contrast dye. So what they do is they put a tube into your hand that basically, after that first scan has been done, they then put contrast dye. And the contrast dye, what it does is it makes it so that the CT scanner can see your coronary arteries lit up, because it makes it to where the lumen, which is the inside of the tubes, if you will, brighten up to where now they can actually see the contours and everything, so that you can actually see like the plaques at a high resolution level.
Okay.
And so that's the comparison between those two scans. Getting to cost, CT angiogram can get pretty expensive. It's depending on where you get it from. Here in the States, like 650 to, in some cases, like 1,500, even 1,800 sometimes. But yeah, if the benefit of the CT angiogram is you see not just calcification, but you see non-calcified plaque. And so what many would say who are not as big of fans of the CAC is it doesn't see soft plaque, whereas a CT angiogram does. And it is true that it's rare, but some folks who have a 0 CAC could have concerning levels of soft plaque. But let me just fit in this one last thing, because I will tell you, 2 years ago, I saw one of the most incredible studies ever. It's 23,000 patients out of this study in Denmark. Took place between, I want to say, 2008 to 2017. And if I'm not mistaken, it's quite literally every single patient that was there that got referred to get a CT angiogram done that was in their healthcare system, right? And this was kind of one of the benefits of them being able to leverage that data. The catch is that they were all symptomatic. That's why they got referred to get to the scan. But in spite of them being symptomatic, there were 2 major findings from that study that are worth highlighting. One, if the plaque levels were low, especially if the CAC was low, the LDL did not have an association with future events because they did follow up, right? Interestingly, low LDL also had, like, if you're looking at trends, it was U-shaped. So there was like a slight change on either end of the tail, whether you had low or high, but it just wasn't that predictive. Unless you had high LDL, then it was more predictive. Or sorry, unless you had high plaque levels and high LDL, then it was a little bit more predictive. However, the second one, super relevant, the CAC, coronary artery calcification, hugely correlated with the CT angiogram. So they were so tight. I was stunned by it. And there's one piece of it that I still remember to this day, which is that that thing I just mentioned where somebody has a CAC of 0. In this study, only 0.4% of those who had a CAC of 0 had an occlusion, that's a narrowing of the artery, of 50% or more in at least one site. So to put that in layperson's terms, the odds of having severe soft plaque in the absence of calcified plaque was extremely low. But while it was extremely low, it's not 0.
Yeah. And over
So again,
time, over time, that soft plaque, now you say you find 10 years later, you're not looking at the soft plaque. Now you've got a problem because it's not a greater than 50% occlusion. Am I right?
yeah. And so again, I'm just going to say for myself and my family, and I can only speak for myself. Don't take this as medical advice. If I have a family member who's just concerned, they have some reason to be concerned about having heart disease, like you could go all the way. You could just get a CT angiogram, and because nothing beats the physical presence of the disease itself. Nothing comes close. It's
Exactly.
so prognostic. It kind of makes sense, right? Like
Mm.
if you suspect you might be breaking your leg because you think you're prone to fracture, because you think you might have a fracture, you could get an x-ray and be like, oh, it looks like I do have a fracture, as opposed to, and that's the difference. In the case of plaque in the coronary arteries, there aren't nerves that are connected to plaque formation that you can feel.
Exactly.
So it's a beautiful thing that we're in a day and age where we could go and intentionally get scanned and find out whether or not the disease is encroaching on us right now.
So well, from your recommendation, I mean, people are spending, thousands and thousands on blood tests and labs and medication or even supplementation in terms of reducing ApoB and reducing LDL cholesterol. They could put that money towards actually going to do a definitive scan like a CT angiogram and get a far better data point and a predictive, process forward of where they're at.
Yeah, I'll be cautious in using the word definitive, right? Because I want to be a good scientist, of course. But I always put it this way, which I think kind of really drives the point home. If you only, getting back to the title of our study, if all you had was our first scan, you just had the baseline scan, and you had to place a bet on who it was, who the 20 people were, the 10 people were who would have the greatest plaque progression, you could work the numbers of ApoB any which way you could. Adrian tried. He tried to find different ways to find those signals of correlation for ApoB and future plaque progression, and it just wasn't there. And it's why he went into, by the way, it's also why he went into Bayes factor. Bayes factor not only takes it outside of the p-value, but it actually gets into just how likely it is of the null versus the non. It's almost like reversing the p-value. Conversely, if you had the baseline scans and you could see plaque in the baseline scans, that was super predictive, very prognostic as to the likely outcome of future plaque progression.
Yeah, which makes sense. So, I mean, I'm going to summarize it, and this is not medical advice, but basically, if you're listening to this and you got any sort of reason to have, the thoughts of heart disease, go and get a CT angiogram. I'm sitting here, I've been an athlete, very, very lean, low carbohydrate diet for a very long time, and I haven't had a CT angiogram. So that would be something that you want to do to set a baseline from what I'm understanding.
Yeah, I'm like I said, I don't know what more there is
Mm,
that I could be more bullish on
yeah.
than quite literally getting the scan itself.
Okay. And the clearly sort of process on top of that, we had Michael Twyman on the show who spoke about the clearly for the first time. That's an AI sort of program or algorithm that can be adopted anywhere once you've got a CT angiogram.
It is. There were some things that we're very interested in. Like I said, there was kind of some differences between clearly and our semi-quantitative. more specifically to our study compared to other studies. And it's just something we're looking into right now. Like I said, I'm excited for the Q-angio that's going to be coming
Mm,
soon. I think it'll help, solidify this data a bit better.
okay.
This is one of the neat things about science, though. A lot of times there are, multiple instruments involved, and a lot of them are kind of aligning, and then maybe they don't align in some ways. And it could be something biological. It could be something unique
Mm.
to lean mass hyperresponders. It could be something about, like, ours was also very controlled as to time of day that they were being scanned. That might be relevant. I don't know. There's a lot that's still unknown that we're trying to figure out.
So in terms of labs and heart disease, if someone's listening and saying, okay, well, what does this mean? Okay, CT angiogram. Great. Got that first thing, want to go and speak. Can I afford it? Okay, I'll save up. Maybe I won't get my medication or supplements for a while, save up as best as I can, get it. Set a baseline. But then in looking at triglycerides, looking at HDL, looking at the ratio of triglycerides and your HDL, what that is, looking at ApoB, we followed Dr. Peter Tier. I think yourself or Nick were on the show. Am I right on the drive? Dr. Peter Tier's.
I
Yeah.
was on with Peter Attia. Nick hasn't been on yet.
Okay. So, I mean, he's a huge ApoB sort of proponent in terms of its role with regards to cardiovascular disease. From your perspective now, you're not a physician, but what in terms of the data and being a scientist, what lab are sort of data points are crucially important that you would focus on? Is it just the metabolic healthy sort of lab test? You're looking at HSCRP, you're looking at fasting insulin, HbA1c, triglycerides. Give us sort of some indication, someone listening to say, okay, well, now what?
Well, you just hit a bunch of my favorites right off the top.
Mm,
So I love, oh, actually, sorry. I was going to go CRP, and you
yeah.
said A1C, right?
I said
Oh,
A1C and HS-CRP, high sensitive
yeah.
C-reactive protein. Yeah.
Yeah. So C-reactive protein, this is worth drilling into a little bit. I like it so much because it is a high sensitivity, non-specific measure of systemic inflammation. Now, the reason I say non-specific, and it may sound like it's a bug, it's actually a feature. It's basically an extremely sensitive way to figure out if your body is currently in a state of systemic inflammation such that there is more circulating uh, C-reactive proteins. It's great for that. And typically, high levels of C-reactive protein, of course, are going to associate, as does inflammation in general, with greater risk for cardiovascular disease. I often, when I'm chatting with people and they're just trying to get a handle on something that's unknown for the first time, I often say, I find for myself, I'm interested in looking at inflammatory markers because that at least tells me if the body knows about a problem and is trying to fight it. So that's like one whole bucket of things. This other bucket is there isn't an inflammatory response, and that at least helps to narrow down from one of these two sides where to head. And part of the problem, I just have to say, this is kind of a complaint of mine in this space, Steve, is inflammation is often talked about as though it's the enemy.
Yeah.
I don't get me wrong, inflammation has side effects that you may want to manage, such as pain, but we would die without inflammation.
Exactly.
It is absolutely a part of the process of healing, right? There's a whole playbook that's quite complex in biochemistry on the various ways by which inflammation does what it does, but it's part of the immune response. And I don't want to get in the way of my body's natural process of inflammation any more than I need to. I'm going to take it as a sign that I should look to what the root cause that's resulting in the inflammatory response is. So I don't want to attack the inflammation itself, and I consider it a useful signal. So getting back to C-reactive protein, it's one of the best molecules that we've discovered and one of the best ones that I think we can test. But with an important caveat, the caveat is it also can potentially have false positives. So, for example, if I do a workout tomorrow, which I will be, then I take a blood test right afterwards, I won't be surprised if my C-reactive protein is high because I literally inflamed myself, right? Like I actually had small micro tears to my muscle and so on. And so if there's a greater elevation of C-reactive protein, I'm not going to be surprised. So I say this with regard to don't get so excited about this test that you don't think about the larger context you want to get it in. You want to be fasted because, believe it or not, consuming food can also, have an impact on inflammatory markers. And you want to be rested. And then if your C-reactive protein is very low, it's it's a pretty good sign that probably your systemic inflammation is relatively low as well.
Yeah.
It's so broad and it touches so many different things. Okay, so there's that. Fasting insulin. Hello. Of course, I'm so bullish on fasting insulin or C-peptide. So in both cases they're seeking to look at your insulinemic response. And just to state it plainly, there's no good reason that I'm aware of for you to have chronically elevated fasting insulin. Emphasis on fasting. You could be somebody who's a carb eater and you take your insulin, an hour after you ate and it's high. Of course it's high. It's high
Mm.
because its job is shuttling. But it's an anabolic hormone. Anabolic, it builds things up. If it's building things up 12 hours after you've not eaten anything and you've
Yeah.
slept a whole night, that's a bad sign. I'm sorry. That means that probably you're having a difficult time internally managing your fuel. And of course, that's highly associated to cardiovascular disease. So yeah, I love that you hit those two out of the park right up front. And then yes, triglycerides and especially triglycerides to HDL, that's kind of a poor man's marker for insulin resistance as it's encroaching. However, triglycerides are pretty noisy, and you want to be mindful of that. Sorry, let me just fit in one more thing too. Triglycerides, you also want to get fasted.
Absolutely.
During the course of the day, my triglycerides are going to be higher while I'm like eating, and that's because my basal insulin level is lower, and I'm not concerned about that at all because I'm fat adapted, right? But if I sleep 12 hours later, my triglycerides will be like most lean mass hyperresponders will be under 100.
Yeah. No, and I agree. And I mean, we pretty anal about doing fasted blood tests for almost everything because it's just
Good.
from a data perspective, it just makes sense. You're not going to train the one day and then do blood tests, and the next day you're not going to train, and then you're going to eat something before the one test, and you're going to check your iron, your ferritin after lunch. I mean, we just do it at stock standard. It takes a bit more energy. I just think that's better science. But possibly speak about your own background as a scientist, as a software engineer, and how you got into this. Because I think, just it's important that to change this meme, I think you have to step outside of this field almost to see the assumptions that have been made and the memes that have been followed and the thinking that's been followed. How did you get involved?
Well, as I like to joke, even though it's not entirely a joke, fear. So, and quite literally 10 years ago, 2015, in fact, close to this month, I had adopted a ketogenic diet. I felt like everything was going great. I was losing weight. I wasn't even trying to lose, but now I was loving the way I looked better. I was running at the time, so I was training and that got better. I was setting personal records. Everything was roses until I got that blood test with my cholesterol. And to be sure, right up until that moment, I had very little interest in science, much less nutrition or medicine. Like that's what I go to a doctor for. But I really, really, really wanted to understand why I saw this response, but my dad and my sister, who had also started at the same time, close to the same time, because they were inspired by me, did not see this response. Why was that? And as I started looking into how the lipid system works, that system that moves our cholesterol around, I became very fascinated because it's these these objects that move things around relate to me in software engineering because they're like networks. They are what we would call packets, right? The content inside can be a variable, but the things on the outside, there's these proteins that are like called lipoproteins. They're like headers. So they tell where to go within the network and they come on and off, just like other metadata. And so it's actually pretty exciting once you think about it from this analogy, because as I like to say, the the animal kingdom has been doing cloud networking long before us humans were. So it's a very sophisticated, very clever system. And that really did unlock this kind of massive fascination I had in the science itself. Um, I'll be a little bit candid in that I haven't always loved how this process of science works. I do feel like it needs an update to where there's a greater, I think, focus towards objectivity and less towards institutions having a lot of influence and control.
Yeah.
Um, and that's a challenge because I think we're sort of wired as humans to want that. We
Mm.
like there to be an authority. We like there to be, things like guidelines that simplify our process of thinking or having to learn about those things.
Okay.
Um, but that's also just a difference between me as an engineer and this culture. In the world I come from, we're tearing down paradigms every day,
Yeah.
every single moment. Nothing is sacred. Nothing. Can you imagine if like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, put together a panel and they said, here are the new guidelines for how coding and operating systems should be, put together. Like engineers would laugh. They would just think this was the most ridiculous thing ever, right? No, it's the pursuit of knowledge should be that anything at any time can be challenged. Any axiom is on the table, especially if there's emerging data that could put it in question or at least expand on its nuance.
So it's interesting you're saying as an engineer, you own personal story and then you go into the space and spend time and energy and get onto podcasts like Dr. Peter Attia's podcast. And it's almost celebrated that you would sort of question the paradigm of coding and it's validated through funds and through careers where you come into the medical space and the big hospital groups and the big pharma and big institutions are threatened and almost don't, well, they don't want you to question, they don't want you to challenge the norm.
I mean, it's kind of, I think, an old story. It always happens to some degree. There's always some amount of pushback,
Mm.
especially when some things are considered by many to just be obvious. Like especially when there's broad agreement among everyone that's like in the field. But that's all the more reason why in engineering we often find it's these outside the box thinkers that start to disrupt the field.
Mm.
And again, I think it comes back to culture. I think it comes back to sort of building within all of us what the field itself is supposed to be about. And I think the field of science is supposed to be about discovery and embracing of the disruption of existing axioms.
Mm.
It's paramount for us to be able to keep moving it forward.
Now, do you think that's because, like in engineering, like Silicon Valley and the Bay Area and development and technology has almost been privatized to a large degree, where you've got massive political influence and the NIHs and, medical? It seems like those two areas are poles apart. One is validated for challenging and developing and technology, and another is you've got to stay within this sort of Western medical system.
I mean, you don't even need to hear what I would say about this. You could hear what those people themselves have said and have written. There are plenty of scientists, there are plenty of um, journal editors who talk about this openly, especially when they're on their way into retirement, especially when they are no longer stuck with being a stakeholder in something that they themselves may not believe as strongly about. And
Mm.
this isn't to say that there aren't a lot of good intentions across the board,
Yeah.
a lot of people who just want to get good work done, right? But to the extent to where there can be influence, I don't know how it is there,
Mm.
but I can tell you certainly here in the US, there's a tremendous amount of funding that comes from food companies towards the science that's supposed to best ascertain the health value of food.
Yeah.
And of course, again, you don't have to take my word for it. You can find plenty of people who are within those industries that can speak openly on why that can be a problem.
Yeah, got you. Now, what if like the Peter Tiers you went on there and sort of big proponents of ApoB? I'm not sure, Function Health, Dr. Mark Hyman, a lot of these big influencers talking about cholesterol and ApoB. Where do they stand now once a lot of this new research between yourself and Nick has come out? Have they said, hang on, we've got to re-look at this, revisit this, or they just, sticking to their guns in terms of their own understanding?
I haven't actually seen a lot that's emerged from Peter Attia in particular. I think there might have been a recent podcast with Mark Hyman where he was on with Huberman
Hmm.
that was pretty interesting, and he discusses this sort of briefly. But to be fair, I think that there's also sort of a broader understanding that we have like another paper forthcoming that'll be a bit more expansive on this one. And so I think there's some degree of waiting and seeing more, since that's
Okay.
also something we've been messaging directly. We didn't have the most perfect rollout with this first paper. We have a succession of many more to come, and the next one we're actually especially excited about because it'll also include, that pre-registered endpoint that wraps in QANGO, for example.
Okay, so if I'm now with my own patients and clients looking at ApoB but using sort of natural supplementation to bring it down, do you see any sort of detrimental effect in the research with regards to even trying to bring down an ApoB slightly different to LDL cholesterol, in my view, but do you see any detrimental effect using any natural supplementation to bring that down?
I mean, we have the lean mass hyperresponder Facebook group, and these are things that are regularly shared all the
Mm.
time there because many people come and there's a variety of different motivations and interests. And a lot of times people, for example, will start threads on, hey, I've been using this to lower my LDL, or hey, I've been using this to, modify my ApoB. Um, again, not medical advice, I'll just say what's popular there is often if it's from the medical side, if it's like from a prescription side of the fence, there's absorption, such as enzetamide, for example. A lot of lean mass hyperresponders like that. There's as far as taking it down in a quote unquote natural way, you can actually leverage our existing research. If you can tolerate a modest increase in carbs that changes the glycogen store levels in the liver, which is what we posit is the major relevance towards that fat trafficking. And many people can do this while still being low carb. They may bring back, say, 70, 80 grams of carbs, for example. Somebody, for example, might add a sweet potato a day. And that can have a big effect on their cholesterol levels, again, because we would posit that there's a bit less trafficking. There's a little bit more insulin, which gets back to that degree of the trafficking itself as far as volume wise. And so, in a quote unquote natural way, that might be the way if you tolerate it. But let's say you're on a ketogenic diet for efficacious reasons, like you have epilepsy or something for which you really do need to keep the carbs super low. Then yeah, there's a lot of options, obviously, pharmacologically.
Hmm. Okay, brilliant. Okay, so CT angiogram, hopefully use maybe possibly an AI algorithm. Then you look at metabolic health. Is there anything else that you know with regard to cardiovascular health that's crucially important, like a homocysteine that we look at, or B9, B12, any of sort of things that stick out, a vitamin D from cardiovascular health? Because you probably set your own algorithm. Being an engineer, you're saying, okay, CT angiogram, people have asked you. Okay, metabolic health, great. What is the next thing with regards to what you look at from an assessment perspective?
I do think vitamin deficiency is a concern, and it's funny you mentioned vitamin D. That's one of the first places I would go.
Mm.
It's a it's one of the most common things that are that there is a deficiency in the Western population for. There's Matt Budoff is connected with studies on, I forget what the name of the trials are, but they're working with EPA. The EPA is omega-3, of course, that you can get through food. Their intervention is more of a purified EPA. Like I said, there's a medical name for it. But my inclination, I don't know for sure if this is true, but I believe that part of why it works so well in these trials that they're doing is because it's probably meeting an existing deficiency, that there's not enough omega-3 that people are getting from diet, which wouldn't surprise me.
Of
And
course.
particularly, Yeah. And so it's finding and nailing down those deficiencies should be one of those low-hanging fruits that's pretty easy to hit,
Mm.
I think.
All right, we're coming to the end of the show. Anything else you think, Dave, that's really, really important? Someone's listening because I think they've got sort of a nice sort of framework now.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say broadly, I appreciate everybody who's helped support us to get this research done because it just doesn't get done without your help. And I'll fit in my one little rah-rah of please continue to help support citizen science research
Mm.
because it's the only, it's how we can make this happen. I'd kind of hoped on some level, Steve, that as we made these advancements, it would inspire more. I'm an optimist.
Yeah.
That maybe the NIH or someone would be like, huh, this really is novel data. We really should start, getting behind things like this a bit more. But no, I think crowdfunding is just the way we're ultimately going to continue to achieve these milestones. And so, yeah, bear that in mind. And once again, thanks to everybody who has supported us to this point.
Just maybe unpack Citizens, just exactly where people can get you and your involvement there and where you guys are at and what you're looking forward to.
Yeah, so you can visit citizensciencefoundation.org. We have we successfully fundraised and completed and paid for this first study. We're currently fundraising for a second study, the Triad study, which is going to be similar to this one, except it'll have a control group and it'll have modestly more permissive eligibility, so it's a little bit more generalizable. But yeah, if anybody's interested, they can go to citizensciencefoundation.org and donate if they'd like to. That's also where you'll see updates on the study as it comes out. And yeah,
And
that's
social media, I'm not on Facebook. My channels are LinkedIn and Instagram. Where you said a Facebook group, is that sort of place people can go?
we do. People could just do a search for lean mass hyperresponder in Facebook, and they'll find our group.
Okay.
It is a private group, so you will need to answer a few questions to get in, but it's pretty
Mhm.
straightforward.
Okay, just give a message of hope. Cardiovascular disease, I'm seeing earlier and earlier in practice here, 18 years of functional medicine and 26 years here in the practice. Since COVID, things have, from a cardiovascular disease perspective and events perspective, I've never seen it to this degree ever. But a message of hope for people in terms of the future, what's going to be happening with chronic disease from a, I don't know, frequency perspective, early onset perspective. Where do you see it going?
I'm I'm an engineer, so naturally I'm very excited about AI. I think AI will save us from our subjectivity. I think it's going to be better at being more of the objective voice in the room if we let it. Emphasis on if we let it. Part of the challenge is that just like anything else, there's already people wanting to corrupt it and program it to hold to existing paradigms and axioms. But I think that even in spite of that, it's going to be a powerful means by which we do earlier diagnostic uh, capability, both for determining disease then and earlier, but also towards figuring out the root causes to stop it for later.
Okay, brilliant. So AI, and then do you think there's going to be, as an engineer, I'd be able to formulate my own AI to say these are the influencers or these are the doctors. Say, let's say Peter Diamandis from Life Force or longevity from Dr. Youth or whatever, and I can use that frame and those and their work to formulate something based on very specific parameters and variables. Because now, if you put something into Grok about the vaccine, and I'm privy to years and years of this here, then you get this sort of convoluted sort of story. Obviously, that's there's biases there, and so do you think that's going to be a possibility as a practitioner or running a sort of a technology business?
Yeah, but the biases are often literally trained in. So the a lot of times where you feel an AI is giving you an answer that's kind of quote unquote safer toward like mainstream thinking or something like that,
Mm,
that's because the AI is supported by a business and the business needs to be mindful of the AI creating controversy that could end the business. So it's literally part of the, yeah, for the same reason, people like you and I would be mindful of things that, might be pretty easy to state out loud as being fact-based or something to that effect, but for which there can be a problem socially,
Okay.
depending on what it is. It's just one of the challenges, though, because science, again, should be about, the freedom to just discuss these things
Mm.
openly. But AI at least can be more appropriately cornered into saying things truthfully. And there's multiple versions of it, right? So that's part of why I feel as good as I do now is I think the capability of getting to the truth, all else being equal, will be enhanced by AI.
Oh wow, that's a good summary. So you could build your own AI now as being an engineer to take the information where you wanted to take it from and assimilate it and look at patterns and look at recognitions and be able to formulate something based on where you direct it.
Yeah, and bear in mind, you can quote unquote trick AI by analogizing all the time. So if you suspect it's trained into something for a particular, you know, unpopular position, you can effectively arrange all of the same variables, create an analogy, and then get more of a direct answer, which is a debate tactic
Mm,
too, right? But for trying to get people to concede things that are logically consistent, if only you could get it anonymized away from the topic that's got too much emotion baked into it.
got you. Well, Dave Feldman want to declare favor and blessing over you that you would rise up in this calling. Lots of courage to you, trusting that we'll direct our community to citizenscience, you said, .com. Is that correct? Yeah, and
CitizensScienceFoundation.org. Yeah.
citizensciencefoundation.org. Okay, so brilliant. And the Facebook group as well. And yeah, just want to make an offer to come back to South Africa here, come stay with us and on our network. Really want to welcome a lot of our guests here and just appreciate your courage. I don't think this has been easy, and you probably haven't told us about all the pain and the stress and the distress and the defamation and all these things when you come up and rise up with some new research. But appreciate you and just declare favor and blessing over you and your family.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of comes with the territory. I sort of knew it would, but yes, thank you for the very kind words. Appreciate it, Steve.